My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
All right, folks, welcome back to a new episode of Diplomatic Immunity. And this week, Tristan and I are back together, chatting about some of the biggest topics going on in foreign affairs right now. And sadly, we will be talking about Iran once again, which we kind of assumed would happen the last time we met. But we're also going to talk about elections in Hungary from this past weekend. But first, how you doing, man?
Yeah, I'm well. I was in Europe last week, which was very good, and then I just got back to Hong Kong, and now I am so profoundly jet lagged. My body is really upset with me, and so I'm having very wakeful nights, and I'm really hoping that the melatonin will eventually work one of these nights because this can't go on.
Yeah, well, yeah, melatonin. I mean, you're going to be taking like 60 milligrams. But I hope for your sake that it does work. It's been busy around here. We started had a nice little trip to Costa Rica for my first trip there. Highly recommend. It's a great place, great people, fun trip, and it was good to get a little break. But now we're back at it. Busy stuff. You just participated in a working group we had at
fantastic.
ISD last night, talking about the effects of the Trump administration's new policies in Latin America and, well, Western Hemisphere writ large. So that went well. We've kicked off the spring baseball season for Vienna Little League. So we had our big opening day on Saturday morning and our first game Saturday afternoon. And I can happily report that we are currently 1-0. So it was a good win to start off the season. Graham Slam McFarland went 1 for 2 with a single and a walk. So he was pleased with his performance. So so I gotta say, no offense to my other previous teams, but this team looks pretty darn good. So we'll see what happens throughout the season. It's a long season, that's why we play the games. But
Excellent.
But we'll see. But anyways, on to bigger and more important things.
Well, after over a month of war in Iran, we've hit a period where diplomacy really is, or at least is trying to be the center stage in this this episode of the Trump reality show Nightmare. There has been a flurry of activity going on. Of course, this past weekend, there were the talks in Pakistan, hosted by Pakistan, between the Iranians and the Americans. The American delegation being headed up by J.D. Vance. They met for just under a day, and the talks ended in failure. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. I mean, I wasn't expecting anything to come of them much at all. The issues that are fundamentally on the table around nuclear enrichment, around certainly the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, around Hezbollah and Lebanon. I mean, these are issues that, particularly on the nuclear front, that have been discussed for years and years and years. A weekend with J.D. Vance, it doesn't seem to me is going to suddenly solve them. So I'm hardly surprised about the outcome, but hopefully, and it certainly seems like more talks are on the way pretty soon, and I'm hopeful about that. But we also then have the American president declaring that he is going to now be having the American military blockade Iranian ports. I think, it's been about a full day now of the blockade, and apparently no ships have passed through. One of the questions on my mind that I'd love to talk to you about is, well, what happens when, say, a Chinese ship is ready to make the run? Are the Americans really going to tell them to stop? Are they going to fire on a Chinese flagged vessel? And so, there's the that element in theater that I'm curious to hear your thoughts about, but also then the broader diplomacy at play. What is it, between 80 and 90% of Iran's oil exports go to China. Iranian oil accounts for about 16% of all Chinese oil consumption. Like, this is a big and important relationship to both parties, more so to Iran, and Beijing has been their lifeline for many decades now.
Yeah.
But if the Americans are going to be blocking all ships coming out, it seems to me that this is a time that Beijing has even more reason to enter this conflict, not necessarily militarily, but certainly diplomatically. Yesterday, I think it's no coincidence that in Beijing, Xi Jinping hosted both the Spanish prime minister and the ruler of the UAE, and so there's a lot of diplomacy afoot, not just in Pakistan, but in Beijing. Of course, this Friday, the UK and France have announced that they're going to be hosting a summit in Paris jointly on the opening of the Strait. So there's a lot going on, and I get that was a very bird's eye view, but boy, we need to be taking a bird's eye view with so much going on. Kelly, what are your thoughts? How are you reading all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head that this is it boils down to a few fundamental issues that they're discussing, but there's so many different pieces to this, and it's a fluid situation, right? There's not, this isn't like the Obama administration negotiating for 2 years, which also points out the fact that, 21 hours seems like a long time to negotiate, but the JCPOA took 2 years.
Yeah,
right.
precisely.
So, and a coordinated Western response plus China towards sanctions and towards Iran and trying to get them to the table to negotiate something. So, to your point, I wasn't surprised that they didn't come away for anything. They're both going to go in with their hardest lines to begin with. And the U.S. side obviously did that. I think it's interesting, though, that J.D. Vance is leading this because Vance was, from all reports, is the one within the administration that was kind of questioning this the most to begin with. And this is, antithetical to what J.D. Vance wants as far as U.S. foreign policy goes. So will that create a situation where maybe he's more inclined to potentially at some point reach a deal that is maybe a little bit out of bounds for the president? But time will tell. And it's ironic that we're looking at this and some of the things we're discussing about nuclear proliferation and enrichment, and it's we had a deal, and they decided to tear it up, and now then they had to go to war, in their minds had to go to war to try to stop them from doing this. And now we're in a situation where we are trying to renegotiate something, and now the Strait of Hormuz is in play that was in a way that it would never was before, right? Like there was never any, now the Iranians are talking about having some sort of control over access to through the strait. That was never on the table before. And so, we've made our negotiating situation worse in many ways. And what we're now negotiating over is different and worse than it was about 10 years ago when we did the JCPOA. So, I don't see the Iranians giving up enrichment completely, which is the U.S. demand right now. I mean, if anything, like we've discussed the last time, they're more hardline now than they were before.
Yeah.
They're intact, and they really see this as a leverage. Maybe they can come to some sort of agreement on the strait. I think that's lower hanging fruit, so to speak, but not an easy issue. And this blockade issue, like you mentioned, is such a tricky situation. They report said there was like 6 merchant vessels turned back today But to your point, what happens if somebody doesn't turn around? The U.S. is good at boarding ships and knows how to do that, but are they going to board a Chinese vessel? Are the Chinese going to stop? And this has a lot of the Beijing is watching this very closely because there's another strait out there that is in your neck of the woods that would be very important in any kind of conflict in the Indo-Pacific, and that's the Straits of Malacca. So China is watching how this all unfolds very, very closely. We don't have the high-risk nature of this blockade necessarily yet that we did during like the Cuban Missile Crisis and the quarantine around Cuba that the U.S. put in place. But it's, and I've seen arguments on both sides that, shutting down all of their oil going through the strait and really strangling their oil exports could really turn on the Iranians pretty quickly economically. But then there's other reports that, analysis saying that, listen, they were hugely cut off in the first Trump administration and weathered the storm. So, I think we're more at risk now for something to spark off again. I really don't think President Trump wants to do that again. I think, like we discussed before, I really think he envisioned a Venezuela on steroids here.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the fact, the moment it went past like 4 days, I think he was like, oh boy, how do I get out of this? And I ultimately think what's going to happen is we will end up signing some sort of deal that actually puts us in a worse position than we were before this all started. And the other part you mentioned too, like Israel's still bombing Lebanon. How does that play into this? Is that part of the ceasefire? The Iranians are viewing it that way. We're not viewing it that way. How does this all play out? But I don't, the Pakistanis are pushing as hard as they can to get talks started again this week. So I think I do expect that to happen this week at some point. But we'll see.
Yeah. And, it has been almost exactly a year since and I always forget the name. Is it Liberation Day tariffs? What was and there, I remember us a year ago talking about exactly this, where the American president creates a problem, indeed a crisis, a mess, really, of his own making, based upon faulty reasoning and absurd premises, and then tries to solve it, achieves some sort of resolution that is worse than, the resolution is worse than the position that we all began in. And, exactly as we had with the tariffs, exactly as, I shouldn't put it in the past tense, have with the tariffs, here exactly as you say, we have with Iran, where it seems to me inconceivable that the resolution here will be a situation that is better than what it was before, and certainly better than what it was under the JCPOA.
Right. I think that's the big issue, is that I don't see, without some sort of extremely stepped up military operation, sort of the threats that he was making last week or the week and a half ago, I don't see us getting to a resolution that is as good as the JCPOA. And that's the irony in all of this. Turning gears a little bit, there was some really good news for fans of democracy in Europe over the weekend, and that is a longtime Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán and his Fidesz party was booted out of power in Hungary over the weekend, and resoundingly so, with well over 50, I think it's like 58% or 55% to 38%. So the new party and Peter Mayer, the new prime minister in waiting, has a majority. and seems, for all intents and purposes, to be really trying to push back against the cronyism and the corruption that the Orbán administration had put in place over their 16 years in power. I mean, this is the guy that literally coined the term illiberal democracy and like called it that. Like he said the
It's a
quiet
badge
part
of
out
honor.
loud.
Yeah.
Yes. But we talked about this in the past when talking about Poland, I think, and the real test will be how difficult and will it be to remove some of these illiberal people and positions that he's put in place and putting these cronies in power and stuff. How difficult will that be? How entrenched are they? But he does have a majority, so they can, vote things through to hopefully do that. And then there's a question too, and you can get into this a little bit more maybe, about how far is Mayer really going to go? I mean, this guy was in Fidesz 2 years ago and was part of Orbán's party. So how much of this was just, seeing an open politically to move over, or how much is it legitimate that he really is going to combat these sorts of things and move Hungary back on a more liberal democratic path? But it's good news for the EU, good news for democracy in Hungary, and good news for Ukraine.
Definitely. Yeah, Viktor Orbán has played the spoiler role so many times in the EU, and particularly these past years with respect to Ukraine. It is good news for the EU. It is good news for Ukraine, and certainly Europe's support of Ukraine. But look, Orbán was in power 16 years. That is a long time. 4 terms, right? And the extent of his grip on power was extraordinary. And so, I think your twin points are really, really well made. I mean, the one is, how difficult will it be to sort of root out all that he has put in place? I think it will be really, really hard. I do think that the particular structures and indeed just people that he has put in place, it is an entrenched situation. Look, it looks like Mayer will have a 2/3, or indeed does have a 2/3 majority. So he is able to push things through, but removing cronyism, removing entrenched corruption isn't a matter of votes in a parliament. And so is this achievable? We'll see. But then your second point of the pair, I think, is also really well made, which is that, look, he's a right winger as well, formerly of Orbán's party. Oh, he may be decidedly pro EU and anti-Russia in a way that certainly Orbán was anything but. But nonetheless, his political views and almost certainly his political interests are aligned with Orbán, and so I am hopeful, but time will tell. At least on the domestic situation, whether or not there's going to be a big shift. I'm not holding my breath on that, but certainly, unquestionably, when it comes to the EU, when it comes to Ukraine and support for Ukraine, this is very, very good news.
Yeah, and I mean, those are, relatively speaking, easy shifts compared to, rooting out the Orbán had stacked the media, had stacked the judiciary, and all these different elements of government. And he did that. It took him 16 years to do that, right? It's going to take a while if he legitimately is going to try to do that, it's going to take a while to do that and to move that forward. And the big thing is, if it's going to take time, that means he needs to get some wins too, right? To be able to get reelected and keep these majorities in the next elections. And I think, I think the EU has a role to play in this too, right? Like they've had, tons of money frozen for Hungary because of illiberal activities and things like that. And I think, doing some things on the ground quickly in Hungary by Mayer to show the EU that he's moving in the right direction, and the EU being quick to sort of release some of those funds for projects and things in Hungary will go a long way to integrate Hungary back into the EU in a way it was in the past, but also to demonstrate to the people on the ground in Hungary that are obviously have demonstrated that they want to go down that path for more EU integration, be part of the EU, that they're being rewarded for that and that it is the right decision to make. So it'll be interesting to see how that relationship between the EU and Hungary shapes out over the next few months. But I think he's got to be into power by May 12th, I think, at the latest. So it's not a really long wait, but we'll see what happens in the coming weeks.
Absolutely, and this is probably a data point that we will unquestionably be returning to when we consider sort of what is the direction of right-wing populism in the world today. This was something that we spoke about yesterday at the working group meeting. Is brand MAGA, is right-wing populism, or certainly brand Trump, is it poisoned? Is there toxicity around it? Yesterday in the meeting we talked about Mark Carney's incredible election victory, not just when he was elected to office nearly a year ago, but last night, now in 3 by-elections in Canada, achieving majority, something unthinkable 13 months ago, but it's all entirely in opposition to Donald Trump. And of course, on his way to Pakistan, the vice president went in to stump for Orbán, and J.D. Vance, what a Midas touch he has. And so, maybe the excess of the American president, MAGA, and the American First agenda is having a demonstrable effect elsewhere in the world, where others are saying, no, this is not for us. It is Germany and France, certainly in the European context, that I am most paying attention to there. And I do think it's way too early to say, like, oh yeah, the tide is turning. I'm not so certain, but let's take the wins where they come, and I think we can resolutely conclude that this indeed is a good outcome for Europe and for Ukraine.
Yep. So far, so good on that. And Iran, not so much. And I'm sure we will be updating folks and discussing this again the next time we talk. Hopefully there isn't another uptick in military incursions into Iran and missiles being lobbed towards the Gulf or towards ships in the Persian Gulf. But time will tell, and let's all keep our fingers crossed. So, we'll keep updating folks next time.